So quite a lot of my current day-to-day work on my own personal projects, I think, is either directly or indirectly owed to Elm.
Wow, that makes it a huge gateway drug for you.
Yeah, definitely.
Hey folks, welcome back to Elm Town. I'm your host, Jared M. Smith. We'll be visiting with Mika Naylor today. But first, let's talk about our sponsor, Logistically. At Logistically, we make intuitive software for the logistics industry to help logistics professionals make better decisions and spend less time on manual tasks. From quoting to tracking, our transportation management system helps squeeze every drop of efficiency from logistics teams of all sizes. Logistically pays me to record Elm Town episodes as well as pays for our production and hosting costs. We build the front end for all new features in Elm. If you're interested in our mission and enjoy writing Elm, please drop us a line, elmtown@logisticallyinc.com. I'll put a link in the show notes. Now, let me introduce Mika Naylor. She is a software dev based in Berlin, these days mostly obsessed with pure FP languages, Nix and Nix OS. She gave the talk Behind the Lambda at Python Pizza Hamburg 2021. She talked about leading beyond tools, process, and structure with Johannes Moser at WorkerConf 2022. She used Elm SPA to develop and maintain single-page applications in Elm, and more recently used Elm Land to create a tool to help track and document her ceramic works. Mika, welcome to Elm Town.
Hi, Jared. Yeah, thank you for having me.
Dhall?
Yes, that's...
Did I say that correctly?
Yeah, that's Old English for hello, basically.
Awesome. Yeah, I noticed that on your Mastodon profile, so I dug in a little bit, tried to do a little bit of research there. So how did you get started in computing?
My very first start, I guess, would have been when I was early teens, maybe not even quite in teens yet, when I played a lot of the browser MMORPG RuneScape, and ended up kind of moderating and developing fan sites and forums back when forums were a thing people still used, and ended up kind of like diving a bit into like HTML and a bit of PHP at the time, mostly just to kind of like hack together things, and found I quite enjoyed it. I thought it was quite a nice kind of, both a kind of creative outlet and something kind of technical, and decided to pursue that in college. And then eventually I went to university to study software engineering and have just kind of been pinging between different roles ever since, doing back end, a little bit of front end. These days, a lot of like SRE infrastructure, making sure other people's stuff is running, that kind of thing.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So you were administrating and maintaining this forum for the game. And so during that, was there something that you were doing specifically that really caught your interest, or was it just kind of the whole process of doing that?
Yeah, I guess it was kind of the whole process. It was kind of this feeling of being able to type words into these PHP files that were deployed on some server somewhere, and then see that immediately reflected in my browser. It felt kind of like magical to have this thing of like, you type in some words and some strange like symbols and syntax, and then all of a sudden a thing is produced that you can look at and other people can look at and use. And this always felt quite like magical and empowering to me, and kind of made me fall in love with the whole kind of process of making software, whatever that might be.
Yeah, I like that, magical and empowering. And I think for me that resonates with the idea of doing some things and then seeing it in the browser specifically, because it's something that then you can take and you can share that with other people.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
Right. And yeah, that's cool. Okay. So you found this interest and you pursued it. You got an education, doing some back end work, and then some front end. And so this is a question actually from Emily, and quote, how did you first get excited about Elm? End quote.
Oh yeah, it was, so for context, like in university, in my first few jobs, I learned programming through the kind of abstraction of object-oriented programming. Like in university, it was all Java, and in my first few jobs, it was Java, I think a bit of C# here and there. And this always felt kind of like, this is like the teleology of like programming abstractions, right? You start like from like scripting, and then you have this kind of abstraction of object-oriented, and anything further abstract kind of builds on this. I just felt, I kind of just from it being what I always knew, felt like this was like the continual direction. And about like 5 or 6 years ago now, I guess, I joined a company called Crate.io. That was a company based in Austria that was working on a kind of distributed SQL database. And there was an engineer at the company by the name of Jordi who was like really quite inspiring as an engineer. He was interested in lots of cool little things. It's thanks to him that like NeoVim is now like my main like editor. So it was also an influence. And I noticed he was playing with this language within the company, but also in his side projects, a language called like Haskell, which I had heard about, but had never really seen or encountered. And so like I opened up like a Haskell file to like see what is going on, and it looked completely kind of incomprehensible. It looked like kind of like someone had opened up like a wizard's tome, and I couldn't decipher what the symbols actually mean. And the idea that this was like this kind of the paradigm it was using, I found really hard to get my head around. I couldn't quite grasp onto like what functional programming was and why it was different to object-oriented programming for a long time. Like I tried and failed to like get into Haskell and F# for a while and never quite clicked until one day Emily and I went to a meetup in Berlin that I don't think is no longer running, but was called Friendly Functional. And it was the meetup was an attempt to get beginners into functional programming, usually by showcasing a language. And the language that just by chance happened to be the one that was on show was Elm. And I was like sat in the audience, and it felt like it was the confluence of all the things that kind of interest me. It's like, here's a front end thing, like with Elm, you type it, it compiles, boom, the browser reflects this. It's a bit more kind of immediately graspable than, say, a Haskell backend kind of tool, at least initially. And also like the Elm architecture, the model view message update loop made sense to me. And also the fact that like Elm is a functional language but doesn't have as many bells and whistles, let's say, that Haskell does, meant that I was kind of able to like really understand what it was doing. And then I suddenly kind of got it. Like I understood why, like what a pure function was, why it was important, why it was kind of different to an impure function, how you can compose these functions, like all these kind of transformations and things that are, I guess, quite cool to functional programming. With Elm, both the context of like front-end development and Elm being quite a kind of narrow scope of functional programming as a whole really helped like it click for me conceptually. And then kind of ever since then, it's been my kind of like favorite paradigm to work with if I can.
Okay. Yeah. So I wanted to kind of go back to when you were talking about 5 or 6 years ago, you were opening this Haskell file, right? And it was all a lot of, magical things in there and difficult to grasp. And you mentioned also F# that you were trying to learn that. Was that kind of based on this kind of initial experience of like, what is Haskell? What is functional programming?
Yeah, absolutely. I kind of, it's like, why is Haskell different? I mean, at the time I was also programming a lot in Python. So it was like very different, but also similar in terms of like white space indentation, it like kind of a foreign dialect almost. And yeah, I was like, okay, so this is a functional programming language. I will just like look up a couple of them and see if I can get what they're doing. But at the time I was so much in the back end that it never occurred to me to like look for functional programming languages in the front end, for example. I didn't even think that was a thing that existed. I just thought, you have JavaScript, you have TypeScript, sorry. That's kind of, the scope of the world.
Sure. Yeah, I can understand that. This reminds me of when you mentioned your initial experience with Haskell. I completely forgot I had this experience until you said that. But I was at this conference and it was a very like .NET oriented, object oriented programming type of conference. But I happened to walk into this particular talk, and the person that was speaking was actually talking about Haskell and how she was using it to do these very in-depth mathematical things. And I did not understand any of it, to be honest. I felt very out of my league. I was like, kind of like looking around occasionally, like, does anybody else know what's going on here? None of this makes any sense. And I kind of like, okay, I'll hold on a little bit longer and maybe it'll start to make sense. But I got it out of that talk, and I just kind of walked around aloof for a while trying to understand, like, what have I been doing? What, is this programming?
Yeah.
And so that was years before I was introduced to Elm. But then, yeah, when I was introduced to Elm, it was a much different experience for me as well. I was able to grasp it, and I've talked about this before on the podcast. I won't go into detail, but essentially I found what I was looking for in Elm, and found it to be a really nice learning curve. And so you mentioned that FP is kind of your thing now, functional programming. There is another question from your fiancée, Emily. She asks, what other technologies and tools has your journey with Elm led you to use?
So, like I said, kind of Elm broke the kind of conceptual barrier in my mind that like prevented me from kind of getting what functional programming was about. And then for a little while, admittedly, I then had the kind of zealousness of the new convert, in which I was like, all functions should be pure. All functions should be pure. There should be no side effects anyway. And so Elm gave me the confidence to pick up the Haskell resources that I had previously tried and bounced off of. And I kind of got into Haskell a little bit. I understood Haskell. I also was quite interested in the kind of academic-y kind of background to Haskell. So like what a functor was, what a monad was, what these kind of like computer science, I guess, concepts that Haskell uses as part of its vocabulary. What do they mean? And like, even if it's not imminently applicable as a a backend developer, like what is it trying? What do these words actually mean? So like getting a little bit into category theory and things like that was quite fun. And it also led me to start using Rust quite a lot. Mostly because I noticed that a lot of the things that I really valued in Haskell were also present in Rust. Things like being able to like model my domain with sum types and product types and things like that. And also led me to get involved and be a heavy user of Nix and NixOS as my kind of daily driver operating system and the kind of packager and builder that I use for like most of my own projects and things like that. And I don't think I would have been able to really get what these things were doing and why they were important or different to other ways of doing it if Elm hadn't helped me kind of breach this functional programming conceptual barrier. So yeah. So quite a lot of my current day-to-day work on my own personal projects, I think, is either directly or indirectly owed to Elm.
Wow, that makes it a huge gateway drug for you.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and I've heard that from a lot of other folks too, that they tried to get into Haskell, what is this whole thing, and then at some point discovered Elm, got into that, and then was able to like you said, break through that barrier. And so as you're doing this, you're learning these different things, Haskell, some of the concepts behind Haskell that you might not have learned with Elm. But what was it that, let's say, drew you into Nix, and how does that relate to Elm?
Yeah, so the way that I tend to work in front end generally on my own projects, but Elm especially, since it kind of empowers me to do this, is that I tend to be very messy. I tend to just quickly iterate and get a prototype out, and then once it's working and feels like how I want it, then I will kind of go back and refactor and see if I can make anything nicer, see if there's any mistakes somewhere that I've missed, that kind of thing. And I think one of the reasons that I really like doing this in Elm is the whole kind of like no side effectness of Elm. In that, like, once it compiles, like, runtime errors aren't really a thing. And it does this through a whole bunch of kind of like impurity kind of guarantees. And Nix is kind of very much the same way, but instead of being for front end, it's for like package building in general, which struck me as kind of very strange because surely the whole process of building a package is one massive impurity. Like you're pulling packages from the internet, you're doing a compiler on someone else's machine at a different point in time than someone else's machine. And, it struck me as inherently an impure process that you just kind of have to live with. But then I found out that like tools like Nix and also tools like GUIX and a few other tools attempt to make software reproducible through kind of enforcing this paradigm of like the software build process is a pure function of, the software code and its dependencies. And if you have the same code going in and the same dependencies, you should get the same software out at the end of the pipeline. And, that enables you to do lots of nice things like, if you have a pure function in any language, you can then cache the results if it's a computation-heavy function because you know that no side effects can affect the outcome of that function. And with Nix, it lets you do that with the build process as a whole. So you can do cool binary packaging. Once you've built a particular piece of software, it doesn't matter if you build it on your machine, your friend's machine, the CI somewhere, you should get the same hash at the end and the same kind of object, the same product at the end. And so, so this kind of concept of the value of purity and modeling things as pure functions in order to kind of, in Elm's case, like prevent runtime errors, but in Nix's case, to enable reproducible software and binary caching kind of really was like a nice pairing of the two kind of concepts. And Elm felt like an easy bridge between that and the old world of just having like a CI process, just doing like bash commands and like crossing your fingers and hoping it works. And it's the same result as on your laptop kind of thing.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And so it's kind of taking these intended constraints, right? These ideas that if you set your own limits, right? These particular limits, in one case, a programming language, in another case, a package manager or a package builder. What would be the correct term there?
I guess Nix functions as both. I guess package builder, I suppose that's its main kind of thing, but there's also package managers built on top of it. So, and they're both called Nix, so it's sometimes a bit confusing.
Right. So this whole process of building and managing packages takes similar concepts, but applies them to that process as opposed to applying them to programming language and building front ends. Okay, cool. If you don't mind, I would like to ask you a question about one of the talks that I mentioned, Leading Beyond Tools, Process, and Structure at WorkerConf 2022 with Johannes Moser. About 20 minutes in, you have a quote from Paul Finlayson-Adams. It says, "If you follow the do it my way approach of senior engineers, you will end up with an enabled senior engineer and not an enabled team," which you paraphrased as not disempowering teams. And that really resonated with me because of the conversation I had with Tessa Kelly on Elm Town 58, which at the time of this recording is not published yet, but it should be in the next few days. So you may not have heard this, but in our discussion, we're talking about accessibility and how her job is not disempowering folks her job is to not disempower folks or to unblock them. And how do you feel that Elm fares on this scale of not disempowering teams and unblocking users? Because I bring this up because, for one thing, you said earlier was Elm empowers me, and then you kind of related that to what you get with Nix. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, so one thing I find Elm helps empower me and like people that I work with on Elm projects is that it gives me the confidence to kind of work on a particular slice of maybe like a bigger application without necessarily stepping on the toes or impacting my other colleagues that might be working on a different slice because of the way that kind of like, the whole type system lines up, and if it compiles and all this kind of stuff. And I feel that like with Elm, especially also like the Elm compiler itself, you also get this a lot in Rust as well, and not so much in Haskell, where if the compiler fails, it's usually very helpful, and more often than not gives you a suggestion about how to fix it. And I feel this kind of combination of giving developers kind of confidence to like work on a particular slice of maybe a bit of a more monolithic application without bumping into other colleagues, as well as kind of like a quite friendly, I guess I would say, tool set. Like, those like helps me feel a lot more confident when I'm developing, like, because I have like these tools that will give me the confidence to let me know that I'm not going to cause any kind of unexpected, like, say, runtime errors in a certain sense. Like, I might cause some other unintentional issues, but at least this whole class of problem is kind of non-existent, and that gives me a bit more confidence to be a bit more bold about what I'm changing and not worry so much that I'm going to kind of bump into other people. And yeah, like I said, like with the friendly tool set and also the really friendly community, it just kind of feels just generally like a very empowering tool and like tool set to use for both like big and small applications in this way.
Yeah, I can relate to that, I think, because, you're saying that the compiler itself is really helpful and prevents this whole set of errors,
Yeah.
right? And that, I think, for me, it took a mind shift change. I mentioned earlier, working in .NET and C# compiler, it was something where I would always try to avoid those errors because they would be cryptic and usually slow me down in ways that if I just used my mind a little bit harder, maybe I could, solve the problem myself and get out of it easier. But with Elm, it's kind of the other way around, where instead of, once I embraced it, instead of trying to avoid those compiler errors, I just let them happen and then read the nice message and let it nudge me in the direction that I need to go.
Yeah, absolutely.
You mentioned the Elm community as well. Could you elaborate a little bit more on how that contributes to this feeling of being empowered?
Yeah, so my kind of like recent interactions with the Elm community have mostly been through the front end kind of single page application tool you mentioned at the start, Elm Land. They have like a Discord there where, among other things, people like ask questions, but also showcase what they're working on. And I found on the whole, also like across like Elm Reddits and the Elm discourses, that there's a lot of kind of open learning and showcasing of like cute idiosyncratic tools and projects, and not as much kind of bike shedding or hostility that I found in some other kind of programming kind of like spaces. And this kind of, it's just very encouraging, and to see so many people working on so many different kind of cool things and using the same tool set as you. It's nice to, because like, I don't know if you ever get this, but like as a programmer, like often I'm like, have the tool choices I've made are the right ones? Did I choose the right framework? What if I've baked in 2,000 years of terrible technical debt, etc. And it's just really nice to see this kind of ongoing creativity that I think the Elm community especially has. It's really nice and encourages at least myself to keep making things, which is, cool.
Yeah, definitely. This kind of ties into something that I've thought about before with Elm and the community. And, you mentioned that people are encouraged and we see a lot of folks really creating things. And one of the things that I find is that it seems like the ideas are so much different than a lot of the ideas that I find in other communities. But they're different in such a, a lucid way. They're simple and pragmatic, but they take this approach that I think other languages, other ecosystems don't take, because they are stepping back from this kind of flow of ideas, that this kind of zeitgeist that seems to lead different communities, versus with Elm, it's more of a coming from first principles.
Yeah, and plus I think especially when you like work from like more basic fundamentals or first principles, I mean, I love abstraction. Everyone adores abstraction, but I think at a certain point, even if a particular kind of super high level abstraction does a lot of the work for you, and gets you to like say a minimum viable product very quickly, it can often be a little bit disempowering, because so much of like the process of the creation of whatever you're building is hidden behind this like layer of abstraction, which is can be very useful sometimes. It can like let you get like a kind of polished product out the door or whatever your goals are. But one thing I really like about Elm is that there is not as much of this, and that if you're building a tool, you kind of have to start from the basic building blocks. And I really enjoy that as a process. I really enjoy like say designing designing the kind of domain of what I'm dealing with at like the type level, like making like the like type aliases and things for everything to model my application, and then slowly building up function by function, composition by composition, until I'm where I want to be, without necessarily overly relying on a heavy lifting abstraction that gets you most of the way there, but with a lot of the kind of first principles understanding of how what you're building gets to that point kind of hidden. And that's what I really like about Elm, and also about Elm Land, the framework.
Yeah, that is nice. Yeah, I think you're touching on something that I really appreciate as well, that you're saying like the explicitness, right? There's no magic in Elm, because it doesn't have a lot of abstractions that you might find in other languages, and to the point that some people have said, have written Elm off, if you will, for its lack of these abstractions, calling it, quote, maybe a toy language or something like that. I've heard that before. And I definitely think that's not the case. I mean, I use it at work every day. So, I mean, I know it can do whatever problem I'm trying to solve, it can solve it. And so this, like you said, it leads to code that you kind of start from modeling your problem and building it up and explicitly seeing how all those things fit together. And you mentioned Elm Land, and I'm curious because I recorded an episode a couple of days ago with the creator of Elm Land, Ryan Haskell-Glatz.
Cool.
And one of the things that he and I were talking about was how Elm Land does not do anything really magical that you couldn't look under the hood and see. It may feel that way, I guess, at first, because some things are hidden by default, so that you can kind of incrementally learn the tool and to learn best practices through the process. But those things are still there. It's code that's being generated. It's not like, there's some package or there's some abstraction that is doing something, mysterious and magical. I'm curious, though, about your experience with Elm Land and how that relates to the tool, and how you found, maybe you could explain a little bit about the project that you built with Elm Land, and a little bit about how that experience was for you.
Yeah, totally. So the project that I built with Elm Land, as you mentioned at the beginning, is a tool to track the state of my ceramics works. So my main hobby, something that I picked up during the pandemic as a way to keep myself occupied. I took a couple pottery classes with my fiance here in Berlin, and kind of instantly fell in love with it. I really like just being crafty and creating things, and pottery was this very kind of meditative process. It's very kind of repetitive. It's, you have a piece of clay going around and around on a wheel, and you have to kind of be very slow and gentle and careful and considered. And I found the whole process very fulfilling and kind of meditative. And so since then, I've been going pretty regularly for the last year to this pottery studio. I have a like a little membership there, and they have like hours that you sign up for, and then you go and you do some pottery. But the problem was that I wanted to have a way of kind of cataloging and showcasing the stuff that I worked on that I was proud of. And I also wanted a way to, like, when I get to the studio, look at my phone and be like, okay, so I have 3 mugs and a bowl on the shelf where everything is drying and I need to trim them and fix them up. I have a couple pieces, I think, in the kiln for the first firing. And then I have a couple other pieces that should be in the kiln for the second firing, or maybe they're out front to be collected. And I wanted a tool that both kind of showed the outside world, hey, this is what I've been working on, this is what I made, and also like helped me keep track of all this stuff. And so previously, the way that I was doing this is I had tool is a very generous word for it, but I had a Dhall file, which is a kind of functional alternative to YAML and JSON. And so I had the definition of the state of all my works in this Dhall file, and on commit to GitHub, it would regenerate a HTML page from this configuration, and then it would show this is in waiting, this is finished, here's a picture. But this wasn't super easy to use, because if I wanted to update the state of anything, I'd have to edit a file on GitHub, which on my phone at the studio with my hands covered in clay was not super optimal. So I wanted something that was a bit more, like a kind of real front-end application where I could sign in, I have a dashboard, I can click buttons, hit update, and it like updates everything, maybe with a database backing it rather than just a big configuration file. And so this is where my tool comes in. So it's kind of a showcase of my pottery work and a way of letting me track and update the state of all my works. And so it's an Elm front end, and the back end is Rust with a library called Axum, which is a tool for creating like REST endpoints and things like this. It's a bit like Flask if you've ever used that in Python. And so the tool that I used to help make the front end was Elm Land. I previously used the previous iteration of Elm Land called Elm Spa for a side project that I never finished. When I was between jobs, I was incredibly annoyed from my previous jobs. They heavily relied on GitHub workflows, GitHub Actions, sorry. And it was very difficult to know, like, judge whether these workflows had the runtimes for like tests or end-to-end tests had like increased dramatically or decreased dramatically, whether the work we had done as SREs to speed up pipelines was really having a good effect on the aggregate. And my idea for that was to build a kind of tool to help optimize CI/CD pipelines, but that never took off. But I used Elm Spa for that. And my experience with that was, as well as with Elm Land, was that this is a framework that, like you said, kind of has some stuff going on under the hood to enable you to build up an example very quickly. But you can just go into in Elm Land's case, just go into the .Elm Land folder, I think, with all the generated code and be like, oh, this is how the whole thing hangs together. And if you need to modify the auth or the effect stuff, then you just pull it into your own code and then you modify it and then it's under your control. And yeah, my experience of using the framework was like really seamless. It provides a lot of like really nice basics for getting single page applications, for auth, for doing like routing and everything in a way that kind of makes it very easy and quick to build prototypes, deploy things, try stuff out, but also gives you the power to be like, okay, I need to customize this. I want to really change how this behaves at a fundamental level. I'll pull it into my project and tweak it, and then it's mine to both kind of maintain and control. And yeah, it was a really lovely experience. I can really recommend Elm Land for building kind of single page applications with Elm. It gives you just enough abstraction to get the ball rolling, but doesn't kind of try and hide everything behind a magic curtain. And if you need to like pull out specific things or really dive into what it's doing underneath the hood, it makes it very, very easy and upfront about that, which I really, really valued.
Yeah. Okay. And so there's a lot of things I want to ask about here, but let me start with this, kind of going back to the explicitness that we're talking about here with Elm. And I think that what you're saying is if these things are hidden, you can still get at them. Like you said, they're in that Elm Land folder, but I'm guessing also that references to different files that may not be immediately displayed in your source folder, those you could get to if you're using like VS Code or the IntelliJ Elm plugin. You could go to those definitions of those things, and see that code even inside of that folder. Right?
Yeah. So I have the language server protocol implementation for Elm in my Vim, and when I want to kind of here's something when I see something in a file that's being pulled in from Elm Land, I can just go to definition and it will like jump to this generated file, and then it's only very plain to see what's going on and where it's coming from, which is I find really, really empowering. It's nice to have abstractions at your disposal, but be able to unabstract them when you want to.
Yeah, kind of like what we were talking about earlier. It's like unblocking you because there's no real blocker there.
Yeah.
With Elm, it's available, and I think if I recall, Evan Czaplicki, the creator of Elm, had talked about some experience, I think, with Haskell of trying to find out like where things were imported, and then with Elm trying to solve that, or actually solving that problem by ensuring that it was clear when things were brought in, where those things are coming from, and by like you said, not including some abstractions that may be very powerful. You get, obviously it's a trade-off, right? Like there may be more code to read, or to, in this case, generate, sometimes write, right? But since you're using Elm Land, a lot of that code gets generated for you. The other side of that being that now you can see that. And at least for me, I feel very comforted by that, by knowing that I'm not going to be working on something and something changed somewhere where I can't see it and then not know what happened and something break because of that. And I think that also goes into what you're saying earlier about working on it as a team, right? With Elm, like even if you did refactor something, you would get a compiler error. Mm-hmm. And if it broke something that somebody else was working on and then they merged in your code, they would get the compiler error, or vice versa. So yeah, that makes really a lot of sense. So I want to ask you then, you're talking about ceramics and how this helped you build that. Could you maybe talk a little bit more about some of the features of Elm Land that you used to build this, and kind of how that workflow was for you when you were building this?
Yeah, absolutely. So the main thing about my tool that I wanted from a kind of a not me user perspective is that when I make a ceramic piece, for example, if I give a ceramic object to a friend that I've made, I want to give them a URL that's like, work2ceramics.com/work/ the ID of the work on like a kind of little business card, and they can go and look at the detail for their object. They can see the timeline of when did I throw it, when was it trimmed, when was it fired, this kind of thing. And so like Elm Land made this kind of mapping a URL route essentially into a backend request to get information about the particular object and display it to an end user, like really, really, really seamless. Like it was really lovely to work with and not have to worry too much about parsing IDs from the URLs, because the way that Elm Land works, that you just get the URL into the init function of the page, and then you just, you make the backend call within and you handle it that way, which is really nice. And also one feature of Elm Land that I was initially dreading, but turned out Elm Land made it super, super easy, was authentication. Because although this website is generally for other people to see what I'm working on and for me to link people. Here's the status of a ceramic object. I also want to log into it, and I also want to use it as, like I mentioned, a dashboard to track and update the state of my works. And so I was like, okay, well, on the back end, I have to implement authentication tokens and cookie authentication. That's all fine. But how do I do this on the front end? How do I like determine whether a user is authenticated, and how do I prevent them from going to roots and at best seeing an error saying you're not authorized to query this backend, or best, like, yeah, a kind of 404 error. And Elm Land, through its like use of like author-only pages and the really easy way that you create and annotate these pages, kind of really took out a big chunk of dread that I had for building this tool. In that it's like, oh, you have this shared model that's across all your pages, and you query a backend function, a backend API, to see whether you're authenticated or not. And if you're not, then you just set, authenticated false. And it just percolates down to the rest of your application, and then you don't really need to worry about it. Your auth pages are authed, and if the person isn't authed, then they don't see them. And yeah, it really took out a big chunk of kind of authentication-based dread, which I found like really valuable and helpful. And also, again, like when I needed to tweak this logic and see what it was doing, I just go to definition. Oh, this is what it's doing. Okay, cool. I can modify it. I can change it. I can like play around with it. So yeah, it's great. It's like here's an abstraction that abstracts away a lot of this authentication problem, but not in a way that like disempowers me or makes me feel like I just have to cross my fingers and hope whatever it's doing is the right thing. It was really great.
Yeah. Well, that sounds like a really nice experience. Yeah. That whole idea, like you said, the dread of like, oh, now I have to handle authentication. What process am I going to use? And yeah, that can be just feel like it slows you down to the point where it can even demotivate progress on a project, right? Where you're like, you know what? Maybe I won't do this, I've been that with, especially with side projects, right? It's like, you're just, it's optional. So if you're not enjoying the process, then, why even do it?
Absolutely.
Go back to Dhall config, or, Dhall files. And when we say Dhall, this is DHALL,
Yeah,
correct?
Yeah.
Talking about that language, yeah. Which is a language that it is guaranteed to end. Right?
Yeah,
like
it is not Turing complete, I believe. Like it doesn't support things like loops, so the halting problem isn't a problem, I guess. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So you can be sure that you will get something out on the other side if you create one.
Yeah, so it has a lot of like power of sort of programmable config files. So like things like JSON where you can have like loops and functions and things like this, but not so that you can accidentally create like an infinite loop while you're trying to evaluate like your JSON file. It's a nice balance of both. I really like it. And again, it has a lot of like type domain modeling, which I find quite nice. Like for example, there's a Dhall model where someone has type modeled a Kubernetes definitions. So you can create like Kubernetes YAML definitions, in Dhall, that are like type correct. So like as an SRE, like this problem of like kubectl apply file, oh, there's a syntax error here, or this key is in the wrong indentation, it should be one back rather than one forward. Well, with Dhall, provides like type level modeling for these kind of things, which I find really, really valuable and useful for reasons that I find it useful in languages like Elm and Rust and things like that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But I guess going back to the Elm Land experience and with auth here, you were able to build this and kind of overcome that that potential barrier, right? You were not blocked by accomplishing that with Elm Land, but also, like you said, this kind of balance of like getting the power to look under the hood if you need. as well.
Yeah.
Okay. What did you use to create the view, the layout and the style of the site? Because at least the front end that we see if we go to the site, and it is beautiful, by the way. What is the site name again?
It's Huerta Ceramics. Huerta it's an Old English word meaning like worker or maker. Yeah, a lot of my
Right
projects
on. Okay.
have Old English names because it helps. It also helps if you're building a package and publishing it to a package repository. Usually, people haven't chosen that. It's quite useful for name choosing.
Yeah, that's super unique. And some of those I did look up, but that one, okay, like a worker, right? Huerta.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, nice. And so, yeah, what did you use to design that and lay that out?
So the initial kind of like layout designs, I use a browser tool called Figma for doing kind of wireframing and playing around with typography and layout and things like this to just get a visual beat on it. But in terms of actually designing the site, and like I use just regular CSS with a pretty convoluted CSS file. I'm not hugely up to date with front end stuff. So when I ask some friends like, hey, I'm making this new project, what should I use for this CSS? Is there any cool frameworks? And I get like 4 or 5 different options, and then I have to try and figure out how I integrate this with like the code builder and also with Nix and NPM. And then at the end of it, I was just like, okay, never mind. I'll just like write classes and write the CSS and hope that it all hangs together.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, there's a certain feeling of having control over everything there as well, right? When you kind of write your own. Yeah, that makes sense. If it's not, if it's something that you already have experience with, CSS is not bad. I think it's one of those things where if I had been able to use something like Matthew Griffith's Elm UI 20 years ago, when I was getting into programming and HTML and CSS stuff, I would have avoided a whole set of problems. But now that I know it, it's kind of like, oh, it's okay. Yeah, because I've already went over that curve.
Yeah, and the nice thing of like writing front end applications with Elm is that it gives me a lot of confidence to make something quite messy, to put it politely, and then afterwards kind of go back and refactor it. So like now it's one big messy CSS file that broadly gives the visual appearance that I want it to, which is nice. And then it's on my kind of to-do list to go back and play around with Elm UI and kind of other kind of style within code tools to see if I can kind of see kind of like try them out and see like how they feel compared to just a vanilla like CSS file. And I really value that about Elm, in that like going back to refactor things is not as much of a headache as it would be with like other languages, other tooling and things like that.
Yeah. So you get that, what I think the term folks use is fearless refactoring.
Yeah.
In Elm. Yeah, I love that feeling. It kind of feels like a superpower at times.
Yeah. Especially since
where you can...
my main language used to be Python. So this kind of approach, and I was not very rigorous about using type annotations in Python. It was very gung-ho, loosey-goosey. If the Python interpreter didn't say I couldn't do it, then I would just do it. And often I messily create like an MVP. It all works great, and then I go back and refactor it, and oh god, I've broken something, but I only know about it after like 5 minutes of it running, or on this kind of thing. And it very much meant that like once I had a messy solution, it just kind of stayed and like calcified, because I was like, well, I could go back and refactor it, but it's such a pain that I am not going to. And like tools like Elm and also Rust and Haskell really help me to get over that fear and just go back and refactor, see if I can come up with some new kind of ways of modeling what I'm doing in a more elegant way, or in a way that like is more maintainable, and in ways that like a lot of other tooling I would be a bit too scared to do.
Yeah. Yeah, I understand that for sure. I have had a similar experience with Python of, building things and also going into a rather large code base with of Python, and then, seeing ways to improve, but at the same time, like, oh, but if I do that, what guarantees do I have that it will have been done correctly?
Yeah.
Will I sleep that night? I don't know.
Yeah, and I'm a very unprincipled developer. Like if the tool that runs or compiles the program doesn't yell at me, then I will usually not like follow through. And although like, I understand that like there's a lot of people don't like this kind of idea of like a compiler that like says, no, you can't do that. Sorry. I find it really valuable because it's a way of like holding myself to account in a way that otherwise I don't think I would do.
Yeah, I think that's human nature, though, really. I think one of the things that for me I will use is this mantra. I actually kind of created it for this year. It goes, there's freedom in your limits. And it's just a reminder to myself that I'm imposing these limits for a reason. I have the freedom where I could choose not to have those limits, right? Like you could choose to use a different language than Elm. But by doing that, you've created a system that enforces that. And then within those bounds, you have a lot of freedom to build what you want to build, to experiment, to try different things, to take the simplest route possible, right? And then if you need to expand when you need to expand, not thinking ahead, thinking 3 steps ahead. And that's something that I definitely felt with like JavaScript, or that I have to think with Python. It's like, oh, wait, well, what if?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think there's often a bit more of like a kind of cognitive load there, which makes it, at least for me personally, makes it harder for me to like really throw myself into something if I have to kind of think kind of be very principled about thinking far ahead in ways that like other tools like Elm and Rust and stuff like really like help me get over and help me like iterate quickly and experiment quickly and revert back quickly and things like that.
Yeah. You can just make things, and then you can respond when issues arise by changing things and not feeling like you're going to cause a bunch of problems.
Yeah, absolutely.
So. Yeah. Okay, great. So what are you excited about now? In regard to, it could be anything with functional programming with Elm or just a side project. It doesn't matter.
Yeah. So at the moment, I'm quite excited about, I've been doing it a little bit tentatively, but I'm going to try and maybe do it a bit more productively. I'm trying to like integrate. I mean, there's a lot of like noise and heat around like new like language models and machine learning models. And I've been trying to integrate them I've been integrating them into my development practice, but I'd also like to integrate them more into my ceramics practice and kind of collaborate with machine learning models, if collaborate is the right word. I think it is. With machine learning models on designing ceramic objects and creating them with machine learning models, whether it's with a model coming up with a design and me implementing it or some other kind of configuration. And that kind of, I'm quite excited about, to like kind of take these tools, which I'm familiar with now in my kind of day-to-day programming, and like find applications for them in other areas that I may be unusual and might lead to kind of interesting or unusual kind of outcomes. In this case, pottery.
Yeah, I love that. The idea of taking something that's used in one place and applying it in another in an unusual way, right? That kind of goes back to what we were talking about with Elm and the unique ideas that come out from the way that the culture and community and the leadership fosters that approach. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, that sounds really neat. One of the things that you posted about this was some symbols of how humans and these models collaborate, right?
Yeah.
Is that something you've been working on?
Yeah. So my initial kind of experiment, I was kind of having a bit of existential dread about large language models. Like they suddenly erupted into everyone's consciousness, and like I was getting a bit kind of anxious about this, and a friend was like, "Oh, like don't worry, ask ChatGPT to do a side project that I was planning to do that weekend, which was to write a parser for a 3D object markup that me and a friend were working with the weekend before." And I did it, and ChatGPT outputted a pretty decent parser for this language, and I was like, "Oh, okay, that's not really helped me feel less worried." And so I wanted to kind of approach language models and like machine learning models more as kind of like collaborators in a creative practice, inspired a lot by some Berlin-based artists called Matt Dryhurst and Holly Herndon, who have for the last few years been doing a lot of like music and art-based collaboration with machine learning models way before kind of the current explosion of large language models. And so I thought, well, it would be cool to approach ChatGPT not as a program generator, but as a collaborator. Because I feel like the way that these large language models at least work now is that like often they behave how you want them to behave. So like if you come to a large language model and come at it as a collaborator on a pottery project, it throws itself into that role. If it feels like they're quite good at role playing in some strange way. And so I approached ChatGPT and said, I want you to be a collaborator on pottery with me. I want you to specifically model this interaction we're having as a collaboration between a human and a machine, and come up with a kind of symbolic schema to represent this, and come up with a few patterns that are combinations of the symbolic schema that will like encapsulate the idea of me going to a machine learning model and collaborating with it. And it put out a few descriptions of like a few triangles and circles connected by lines to kind of encapsulate this idea. And then I created stencils of them in Figma. I printed them off, and I went down to the pottery studio and I made some coasters and inscribed these symbols onto the pottery. And in the end, now I have a set of 5 little coasters where the symbols on them were designed by a large language model, but made in collaboration with a human. And that felt kind of both exciting, because I had never collaborated with anyone on my pottery, human or machine. And it felt like a way of like being empowered by a large language model rather than feeling kind of anxious about it. And I wanted to go forward with this kind of like collaborative mindset in my like creative practices.
Yeah. Wow. That's really neat. And so you were doing this collaboration, as a way to get over this this dread of what these tools might become. And so you feel like that was a nice experience, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. It it was a really nice experience because it showed me that like here is a thing that I would not have done without this tool. Like if this tool hadn't existed, then I would have never had this idea. I would have never made this particular pattern, and these objects that are now in my in my apartment would not exist. And this felt kind of productive and creative and collaborative and like collaborational in a way that like I felt like more empowered by than kind of disenfranchised by. Although part of me was also a little discouraged by the experiment because as I was like in hour 2 of cutting out stencils on a piece of paper, like hunched over my desk, I was like, oh, the machine learning model did the creative design, and now I'm doing the fleshy, real world, like fine motor control, cutting out stuff. And I was like, oh, I hope this isn't the relationship I have with these models going forward. So yeah, mostly
Right.
positive, but with like a slight kind of disquieting kind of vibe to it, which, is also productive for creative practice, I feel.
Right. Yeah, and I think the idea of you setting up this scenario, right, and you kind of giving it the prompts was the creative act, right? Like you had to think to do that, and you had to think to apply it in this unique way. I'm really excited to see how your experiments continue to evolve with this. If we wanted to get more information, would your Mastodon account be the best place to look for that, or would you possibly share that stuff in the future on your blog?
Yeah, I think so. My Mastodon is probably the first place I'll post it. But I will either be on my ceramic site, or I think I might also write a blog post to kind of like detail my thoughts on the whole kind of process of collaborating with language models on creative projects that aren't necessarily programs. But yeah, my Mastodon is probably the first place I'll go. And I already have a new language model collaborative process going, but at the moment the pieces for that are still in process. And yeah, so my current idea is there's a video game called Dwarf Fortress. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's like a kind of base building game where you manage a kind of Lord of the Rings Moria style community of dwarves, and you dig into mountains and find minerals. And one thing that happens in this game is that dwarves get struck by inspiration and have to hold themselves off in a workshop and make an object. And I like to interpret this as kind of like they've been struck by like divine inspiration and they have to like make an object. And I was like, what if I approach language models this way? And what if I approach language model as a kind of inspiration, like an inspirational voice? And whatever the language model says, no matter how impractical it is, I have to try and make it at the pottery studio. So I have a little tool to generate pottery prompts for ceramic objects that I then try and replicate, even if the outcome doesn't make any physical sense. So.
Ooh, yeah. See, I like that. And you're setting your own artificial limits, right? Within this, and then working within for the creative freedom within that. I love that. That's so cool. Can't wait to see how that comes out.
Thank you.
Okay, so one last thing before we get to picks. You mentioned the blog that I think this was your 2023 kind of beginning of the year kind of goals for 2023, if you will. And one of the things was you mentioned Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to ask you how you would kind of compare Stoicism with Elm and functional programming in general, if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, Stoicism is a really useful tool for kind of keeping a level head about like my own emotions. I came to Stoicism during the early pandemic after a close family member had passed away and I was not doing so well emotionally. And I found Stoicism as a really useful way of grounding myself and being aware of what I can influence and what I can change and what I can't influence and what I can't change, and like being able to like keep my scope, I wouldn't say narrow, but keep my scope kind of focused on what I can be impactful in as a way of like balancing and regulating my own emotional state. And I feel like with Elm, there's a few similarities in that Elm also encourages me to keep my scope focused. Like we said at the beginning, Elm kind of encourages me at least to build my projects and my like front ends from like first principles. And this kind of encourages a way of keeping the scope of what I'm building quite constrained and doing a lot of impactful work within that scope rather than kind of getting distracted or, making sure the framework can handle every possible permutation of any possible event in the known universe kind of thing. It allows me to kind of keep my scope really focused and impactful and expand it when I need to incorporate new features or new ideas. But otherwise, it helps me not get overwhelmed, which I found I get quite a lot with a lot of other tooling. And I think that Stoicism also like is a way of like not getting overwhelmed. And I feel the two kind of dovetail quite nicely.
Yeah, that's well put. I talked about this back in 2019 about JavaScript fatigue, where this idea of all of the decisions that you have to make in the front end world if you're choosing a framework, a JavaScript framework or a TypeScript framework, and the language and the UI tools and all those things, that decisions that you have to make can be very overwhelming. And so I think that fits very well into how I feel about Elm. And also yeah, for me, Stoicism is a way for me to have a calming effect and to kind of, like you said, regulate myself to understand, okay, whatever the thing is that's going on, what's actually in my control. Okay. And that's the limit, like, of where I can reasonably think about and focus on, as opposed to focusing on things which are out of my control. So yeah,
Absolutely.
very cool. Okay. Did you have any other things that you wanted to add before we got to picks?
No, I don't think so.
Awesome. All right. Well, Mika, what picks do you have for us today?
Yeah, absolutely. I would recommend, if it's not already obvious, the Elm Land front-end framework for building single-page applications. It's genuinely been really helpful in letting myself be creative and otherwise getting a project off the ground that I might have found overwhelming at first. I'd also like to recommend the book that I finally went to after Elm opened the doors of functional programming to me, which is a book by Miriam Lipovacha, I think I was pronouncing it right, called Learn You a Haskell for Great Good. It's a resource that really kind of, once I was open to seeing what functional programming was about, it really helped me kind of get on board and explain concepts like functors, monads, the kind of stuff that Haskell trades in a way that I didn't find alienating or kind of overwhelming, which I really valued. And I'd also like to recommend a book that I have been reading lately, a book by Donala H. Meadows called Thinking in Systems, for which I also kind of situate in my head a little bit alongside Stoicism as a way of understanding the world and breaking it down into systems and how the systems interact and what part of those systems I can have impact in and what part of the systems I can't have impacts in. It's a way of kind of, also helping myself not get overwhelmed by the world.
Wonderful. Yeah. Did you have anything else?
No, I think that's everything.
Okay. Excellent. Yeah. I will start with my pick. It's basically all things Mouse Reeve. And I'll start with one that when I was first introduced to Mouse, they gave a talk at Strange Loop 2018 called Mapping Imaginary Cities. And it's about this procedurally generated map or a number of them that could be generated. But they talk about this in these creative ways. They talk about it in technical ways. They talk about it in the context and through history. And I mean, by the end, actually right now, just talking about it gives me a little bit of goosebumps. So this is on YouTube. I will put a link in the show notes, but love that talk. The second time I saw work by Mouse was a Strange Loop 2019 talk. You should see a pattern here called Minimalist Piano Forever, where they talked about a project to recreate Eric Satie's Notions number 1 infinitely. So being able to kind of generate and then just let that continue to play. And again, kind of took this approach of doing some research, some background about Eric Satie and about some of the technology and about the struggles of building that as well. A great talk. The last thing by Mouse Reeve that I will share, and they have a website, mousereeve.com, and I'll put a link to that. But the last thing that they've created is a site called Bookworm. It's actually a network of sites, but it's a Goodreads alternative that, quote, is ad-free, anti-corporate, and federated, end quote. And so, we talked a little bit about large language models and about, generating things and some of the fear around that. And I hope that these products, they're not the products, but these things that Mouse has built, especially the Mapping Imaginary Cities, the Minimalist Piano Forever, those things I think are really neat and unique things that have been built that I don't think even if a computer had built them, I might not be as interested in it as I am when I actually get to see how a person goes about doing this and the struggles that they face. You don't see the struggles that a computer, a large language model, faces when they're trying to design something. You just get an answer, right? And I think there's something to that about that connection. And so, yeah, the last thing I will say, it's not really a pick, it's more of just a request of the folks that are listening. If you know anybody who's working on something related to climate change and you want to hear them or you want to talk about the stuff that you're working on, or if there's some way that the folks in the Elm community can help, I would love to hear about that. Please contact me, elmtown@jaredmsmith.com. I'll put a link in the show notes as well for that. And yeah, I think that's everything. So thanks to all the folks listening out there. Please rate and share if you're enjoying the show. And thanks, Mika, for coming to Elm Town.
Yeah, thank you. It was wonderful chatting to you.
You as well. Bye. Fahr gesund.
Danke.